unanimous decision of this court is that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to a biological woman and biological sex. But we counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not. The court will now adjourn.
Oh wow. Finally, basic common sense has prevailed in Britain. What the so-called Global South has known for years has finally clicked in place in Britain. We are talking gender identity. How a small group of bullies was allowed to bully the majority in Britain is beyond me. To you and me, it was common sense. However, when you live in a country with a number of sickos, even common sense has to be taken to court. You heard me right, we needed the court to tell us what a woman is. Hello everyone. Thank you to all my subscribers. I will never be able to thank you enough. Anyone watching this and has not yet subscribed, please I ask you to subscribe, like the video and share it with your family and friends. Thank you. Britain's Supreme Court ruled Wednesday that the terms woman and sex in the Equality Act 2010 refer to biological sex, not gender identity. The decision followed an appeal by Campaign Group for Women Scotland and clarified that transgender women with legal gender recognition are not included under the law's definition of woman in certain contexts. Deputy President Lord Patrick Hodge emphasized that the ruling should not be seen as a societal victory or loss for any group. It is bloody sad that we have to go to a Supreme Court to get a judgment on what is obvious. I'm so proud of this court. I would never think in 1,000,000 years I would read or hear something like this ever. When I first heard people talking about it, I thought it was a comedy skit. The woman has been defined for hundreds of years. Think of all the people who have had their lives destroyed and lost their jobs or have been cancelled because of this ridiculous nonsense. They need to start suing everyone who's been actively hounding and destroying their lives. Do you remember the lecturer who was hounded in the University of Sussex for speaking the truth about the trans? Starmer is quiet today because he knows he has been exposed as a hypocrite and now a coward for not coming out with a statement which contradicts his previous very public statements. Starmer loves talking about the rule of law until the law is reaffirmed by the Supreme Court to what it actually implied at its drafting and how it should be interpreted. Starmer is a coward who stands for nothing. Stonewall should be called out for their bullying tactics and shamed for their manipulation of UK law. They know the litigations are coming. They are probably spending millions of taxpayers' money getting lawyered up, when all that suffices is an honest and humble apology. People who can never admit they are wrong are dangerous. The question is which organizations are pushing ideologies into institutions and who is censoring free speech. That needs addressing and measures put into place that stop this and other ideologies being pushed onto society. Now, I am waiting to see the man-woman who always catches the 8 o'clock train from London Bridge to Brighton, whether he is going to revert to his original sex. The fact that this has to go to the Supreme Court shows just how far society has fallen. I'm glad to see that other countries are done putting up with this nonsense. It is about time. You see how this group of people have been messing people's mind with nonsense about definition of a man and a woman for years. In fact, idiots even begun doubting themselves. Some weak and misguided teachers were even been allowed to introduce idiocy to pupils. Total madness. Finally happened. Someone finally defined what a woman is. Even the President of the United States of America had to reaffirm what a woman is and what a man is. A weak man like Keir Starmer was not able to define what a woman is. What a shocker. Seriously, human resource departments need to have a good clear out and employ people who haven't been programmed with this madness. I wonder if the companies that have been misadvised by Stonewall can sue the organization out of existence? The costs of redrafting all those HR policies will add up. And if a company has been sued by a former employee that was incorrectly reprimanded or sacked on Stonewall's recommendation, it may want to hold the Stonewall liable. When Trevor talks about treating people as a different species, the bottom really drops out of his credibility, this indicated by increased mumbling. Bottom line, I sense he is struggling to defend and justify what he was instrumental in drafting, namely the 2010 Act. I can sense some cover-up. And now we can proceed and discuss issues that really matter, like the state of our economy in Britain and the freedom of speech in the Britain. Why is the council tax so high? If Britain is a first world country, why do we have food banks in UK? Let us take a listen to Trevor Phillips. He was instrumental in drafting the 2010 Act.
And given that, what's your response to yesterday's Supreme Court ruling saying that trans women are not in law women?
Well, first of all, what you've just said is correct with small caveat. not in law in certain relevant circumstances. The important thing about this is very straightforward, and I just want to make a couple of points about it. First of all, what the Supreme Court has done is not change the law. All the Supreme Court has done is tell everybody what the law as intended was. It was never in anybody's mind in 2008 and 9, when this legislation went through, that sex meant anything other than biological sex. Otherwise, we would not have put in provisions in relation to gender assignment. We would not have put in a specific protection for people who had gone through gender reassignment, had we not clearly made a distinction between gender and biological sex. I think the real issue here has been not that the law was wrong or that it has really had to be clarified or has been changed. The real question I think everybody's going to ask themselves is, how is it that over the last 10 to 15 years, authorities, including government and government ministers, have been gaslit into pretending that the law is something that it is not? The point is that what the Supreme Court did yesterday was just tell us what it is, and now everybody's got to unwind the things that they did, where essentially they created procedures and policies which responded to the law as some people wanted it to be, rather than what it was.
You know, we've had the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, suggest that 99.9% of women don't have a penis. We had David Lammy suggesting that a man could grow a cervix. I interviewed Stella Creasy. She said to me in a Telegraph interview, J.K. Rowling is wrong, a woman can have a penis. How did it come to pass that so many highly intelligent and qualified people got into such a muddle about basic biological facts?
Everybody wants to be seen as nice and compassionate. They want to be on the side of people that they think are vulnerable and under some kind of pressure, and that's reasonable. The point about this is none of that has anything to do with what is in the law. What I think happened was a lot of people decided that the way to demonstrate that they care about trans women and trans men is to pretend that the law said something that it does not. We can get all technical about it, but the essential point about the Equality Act is that it sets out categories of people, or characteristics, beg your pardon, which are illegal to use when you're making judgments about who you employ, who you allow services to have, and so on. It doesn't say anything at all about kindness or niceness or anything like that. It simply says that if you treat people differently on certain grounds, that is unlawful. Now, that's got all mixed up with feeling compassionate or caring for groups of people, and the two things are completely different. So what we're now back to, I hope, is a very simple and straightforward thing in which we say, you may not treat people who have had gender reassignment unequally, but that does not mean that people who have had gender reassignment become a different thing, a different species, or a different part of humanity. The trans activists, slightly different, a rather different group of people, much smaller from trans people in general, wanted something different. The law already protects most people who have gone through gender reassignment from discrimination. And to my knowledge, most people who have gone through that basically just want to get on with their lives in their new new situation. And by and large, the truth of the matter is, they can. By and large, most people who I know are trans aren't sort of immediately obvious as trans people, and aren't necessarily essentially spending their lives looking around in fear. What actually I think has taken place, though there are examples of that, obviously, and I'm not going to pretend that nothing negative ever happens to trans people, but I think most trans people just want to, and in today's Britain, can get on with their lives. However, there is a group of people who basically have an ideological view, which is that actually sex is not a real thing, and that they want everybody to acknowledge and accept that. And that, as a consequence, means that there should be no special facilities according to sex. There should be no different treatment according to biological sex, because in their view, biological sex is an invention. It's not really a thing. Now, the truth of the matter is, you've got to make a decision one way or the other, whether you believe this or not. The 2010 Act was pretty clear when we drafted it, when it went through Parliament, that we do believe that. What has happened since then is that this thing has grabbed hold of, if you like, the political and media classes who treat this idea that there is no such thing as a serious one, and that has meant that people have not actually followed the law. And my view, in answer to your question, Kamal, is that that has always been to the disadvantage of the average person who has gone through gender reassignment and then just wants to get on with their life in their new gender. I completely agree. I mean, there were clearly people here who basically wanted to bully everybody else. I mean, let's call it for what it is. It's just straightforward bullying. It is, if you don't accept the world as I want it to be, then you're a bigot, you're transphobic, all of that. What I'd say is two things about this. First of all, that is a very small but very noisy group, and I think, though I blame them, what I blame more are the supposed grown-ups in the room who sat there cowering as they were being shouted at and bullied by these activists. And for example, the case of Kathleen Stock, what were the university authorities thinking when they allowed that to happen? I don't blame, I sort of do blame the students, but actually I blame the authorities more, because that's the point of being an authority. You're supposed to be there to set standards, to create common sense. The other thing I'd want to say about this is just a word about my successor at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Kishore Faulkner, who I think has played a blinder through this, has been unbelievably courageous. She has gone through the most awful abuse and pressure, both out from outside and, I should say, inside the organisation, and she has stood up. One doesn't want to talk about triumphs and victories and all the rest of it, but I would say that yesterday was a vindication of her courage to say that actually this is the law. It is what it is, not what you activist groups want it to be. And for saying that, which is her job, she was described as all sorts of horrible things. So I would say, if there's somebody, along with 4 Women Scotland, who's come out of this with great credit, it is Kishore Faulkner. I mean, the victory here is the victory for the rule of law, actually, not any individual.
Why are organisations, what should organisations like the NHS be doing now? They are still stuck in situations where women are having to make complaints about trans women being able to access women-only services. How has the NHS got itself into such a mess, and what should they do now?
Well, what they should first of all do is stop whining about how difficult it is. It isn't difficult at all. It's very, very straightforward. They have to provide facilities for people of different sexes, and those facilities have to be protected for people of different sexes according to biology. If they want to and need to provide facilities for people who have undergone gender reassignment, then they need to do that as well. But what they must do is stop going on and on and on about how difficult it is for them to balance rights. This is not a case of balancing rights. There are no special rights. By the way, one of the things that has been really infuriating to me, to be honest, is this language of trans rights. There are no special rights associated with being trans, any more than there are associated with being a man. Everybody has the right to remedies against discrimination based on the 9 characteristics in the law, but there's nothing about being trans or being a man that gives you some special rights to be anywhere. So we need to stop using that language. And the health service, which has got itself into this tangle because essentially its chiefs do not want to be seen to be quote unquote unkind or less than compassionate, they basically put off trying to make a decision because what they want to do is to find a solution in which they're not shouted at by activists. Frankly, they just need to get a grip and say to people, this is how it's going to be. We will make sure that everybody has access according to their needs. But that does not mean that we have to pretend that, for example, a trans person is a woman or a man in order to give them the rights. The whole point of the Act, the whole thrust of it, was to give trans people the rights as trans people. Someone who has had gender reassignment does not have to pretend to be a woman to gain equality. They should actually have every right, everything, every equality available to them as a trans person. They should not have to pretend to be something they are not in order to gain access to health service facilities.
And Trevor, what now for the sports arena? Because this is a tricky one now, isn't it? I mean, we've got some bodies who say that trans women aren't women for the purposes of sport and don't let them compete. We had this quite bizarre scene, didn't we, in recent weeks of 2 trans women winning a females pool competition. We've had trans women winning darts competitions. So what now for sports?
Well, I think that the principle of the way these things will work isn't going to be that complicated. I think we just have to bear in mind that when it comes to certain sports, this isn't just an abstract issue. This is a matter of, women's safety and security, and what we've seen in the boxing ring. I cannot understand how anybody could imagine the battering of women in the way that we saw last year is tolerable or acceptable or in any way in line with anybody's vision of equality. I've never been able to understand why anybody defends that. My own view about this is that what will probably happen is that we will, in everyday facilities, there will end up being male facilities, female facilities, and what I would call don't care facilities, or what people might call unisex facilities. And that will be, I suspect that will become normal. In sport, I think that there will be probably 2 categories. There will be a women's category, which is for biological women only, and there will be an open category, in which anybody can play. And I suspect that's probably going to be the common sense way in which we resolve all of the difficulties on this.
Can you tell me, Trevor, we've spoken a little bit about how were so many institutions seized by this issue of activism around trans rights. Stonewall has been heavily criticised. You obviously, as the Commission Chair, worked incredibly closely with Stonewall. Do you think that the critics of Stonewall are right to say they have been a huge part of the problem, because they appear to convince many companies, many public sector bodies, that actually trans rights did somehow trump women's rights?
I don't really know what happened to Stonewall. I mean, they were an extraordinary organisation when they were set up in the 1980s. They led a transformation in public sentiment and attitude, which I think is unparalleled. If you think about the speed with which the British public moved from being not just hostile, but sort of having ghastly attitudes towards people who are gay and lesbians, let's say, in the late 70s to the 90s, the speed of transformation in public attitudes was extraordinary and much more far-reaching, for example, than we've had even today on race or sex. And I think at the centre of that was an incredible campaigning by the leaders of Stonewall, Andrew Mason, Simon Fanshawe, Michael Cashman, and so on. Something happened, I think, in the early part of this century in which you could probably say that there's an argument that says that Stonewall actually was so successful it started looking around for things to do because it had actually achieved its aims, and it chose the wrong things. And it seems to me here they added the T to LGB, lesbian, gay, bisexual, they added to transsexual, and tried to apply the lessons that were related to the first three to the last. And now we can get into the detail of it, but I think the truth of the matter is they just went off on the wrong path, and on top of that, what they then did to everybody was to say, if you don't agree with our stand on trans, which is that there is no difference between a trans woman and a woman, then we are going to out you, to use his phrase advisedly, as a bigot and a transphobe. And I think the problem here is that people folded, rather than saying, that's just not the case here, and I dare you to try to do that. People just folded, and they took instructions which were instructions based on what Stonewall wanted the law to be, rather than what the law actually was. And I think there were some people within that activist group who believed that if you could get enough organisations to pretend the law was something it isn't, then actually in some sense by osmosis, you would eventually establish a new reality that Parliament would eventually have to follow. I think that was the strategy. Now, I can't tell you how many things are wrong about that, but the real problem, I come back to this, is not so much, I guess, that Stonewall was wrong, it was, but that everybody else who knew better simply gave in. And that is my big worry here, that on these issues, people who should know better, people who should be holding the line, and that includes government ministers, it includes the bosses of media organisations and so on, are basically opting for the quiet life, allowing people who really are bullying them to make their organisations do things that they shouldn't, and that's how we get into this situation.
Do you think that any businesses or public sector organisations that are still abiding by Stonewall policies on this issue should pull out of that scheme?
Well, I suspect their lawyers are going to be telling them this morning, we shouldn't be signed up to anything that is clearly unlawful. I don't know the details of the current Stonewall, I think it's the Diversity Champion scheme, but it requires you to do and say certain things that you shouldn't. I suspect that every organisation's lawyers this morning will be saying we need to take another look at this. I should say, there's no secret about this, because I wrote about it in our paper, or my paper, Times, a couple of months ago. I was required to do one of these questionnaires that everybody these days has to do, which are compliance things that you need to do the training, and one of them, the aspects of this training, was to do with equality and diversity. One of the things that you have to go through it, and you have to get the answer right, or you can't go forward in the training. One of them was to do with a conversation that was being held in an office, an imagined conversation, about somebody who wanted to be called by a name which is typically female rather than male. And the guidance in that particular piece of online training was just wrong. It was just unlawful. I knew that at the time. I ticked the box, but then I wrote to the chair of the company saying there is actually no possibility that I will ever comply with this piece of legislation. I've had to give the wrong answer because otherwise I couldn't complete the training. But you need to understand that I will never do this. Now, I think what's going to happen after yesterday is all of that kind of training, which is done by hundreds of thousands of people across this country, is going to have to be withdrawn and rewritten.
So Trevor